In the past few weeks, I've been thinking a lot about Steely Dan in the wake of Walter Becker's passing. And last week, I was at my local record haunt, Dr. Records, and while going through the Steely Dan area, I found this album. I had it on CD since 1999, since they reissued it. And it's considered by a lot of people to be Steely Dan's very best album. But as Donald Fagen himself says in the liner notes for that CD, this is not the sort of person you apparently want to meet in public, especially when alcoholic beverages are being served. And you don't want to give them your phone number or your email address, or you'll have to call your police stalking squad immediately. Donald Fagen's little wry humor about the apparent obsessiveness of the fans of this album. I haven't known any of those people, but you know, Donald Fagen revels in those people. They're great for his lyrics. You know, he always writes about people like that. He and Walter Becker did. Now, for the most part, not always. This is Steely Dan's second album from 1973, but as I was quick to be informed by my friend Noah Natris, this is not actually the first pressing. This is actually an MCA choral pressing with a version of the MCA label I don't believe I have. MCA choral is actually a budget pressing from the late 70s, early 80s on the MCA label. It used to be a subsidiary of Decca, but when Decca folded and got absorbed into MCA, they just added the choral imprint with their basic label and reissued it with this different colored label to be their budget line. And this album is in absolutely superb shape. It's a 1980 reissue. I've seen this album before, and I seem to remember that it's a gatefold, the original pressing of this album. And I'm sure it sounds just as good as this and the CD reissue I have. But Noah himself told me, a little shout out to him there, that these editions of the album sound really good. Now this Steely Dan, by this point on their second album, were a quintet. It was Becker and Fagen, Denny Dias, Jeff Skunk Baxter, and Jim Holder on drums. And, you know, that was the group at this particular time. Now, I'm going to go over this album song by song and give it a review. I've already done so for the CD on Amazon.com, written, but I've been having a good time with these vinyl reviews, and especially Steely Dan, so I'm going to continue that tradition here. The album starts out with a song called Bodhisattva. And, you know, Bodhisattva has a lot of jazz phrasing in its melody, and when you sing it and when you hear it, but the basic musical structure of it is an upbeat, you know, 50s rock and roll, sort of rockabilly flavor. And when you hear the guitar, there's some sort of Chuck Berry kind of references in there. But, you know, there's getting some jazzy turns, so it's kind of a jazzy rockabilly flavor, kind of a interesting feel to the song. After that, you get one of my favorite songs on the album, and that song is called Razor Boy. It's kind of a gentle, jazzy melody, you know, what some people might call lounge. But, you know, Steely Dan were always deliberately evasive with their lyrics, trying to throw you off somehow. But, you know, with references to women in cages, you know, I'm not going to guess what that particular song is about. Probably, as you heard from my earlier quote on Donald Fagen, probably anybody would really want to know except the late Walter Becker and Donald Fagen. But anyway, you know, that's what makes them so wonderful, that they cover the people, as they said later, who want a name when they lose, you know. And the next song on the album is The Boston Rag, which is more of a slow, kind of rockier song to me. Something closer to what they might do on their first album. The next song, the last one on the first side of this, is Your Gold Teeth, which is a electric piano, probably a Fender Rhodes, led, kind of Latin, you know, bossa, jazz, soul, funk groove. The second side of the album, let me show you the back here, begins with Showbiz Kids. That song is kind of a rocky blues grind about going to lost wages. You have to guess where that's supposed to be. The next song is My Old School. You know, with its horns and everything, that song kind of has a Van Morrison up-tempo soul flavor. You know, it's not exactly Domino, I would say, or Brown Eyed Girl, but it's somewhere in that league. You know, then you have Pearl of the Quarter, which is, to me, the closest thing to a country rock song that Steely Dan ever actually did. I could hear the Eagles or even Linda Ronstadt do this song. It has that kind of vibe to it. My favorite song on here musically is King of the World. And I first heard it with my father. We were driving out to our camp at the Pushaw Lake region through the woods. It was for some reason after dusk, and he was playing it. And the part that stood out to me, this is very much a heavy jazz rocker, just jazz fusion rocker with the nature of the drumming and everything. But there's this part where Donald Fagen is playing this almost siren-like synthesizer that just got into my subconscious. And when I was reading YouTube comments on this song the other day, somebody mentioned something about this song having a post-apocalyptic vibe. And when I actually listened to the lyrics, it does seem like that. He's talking about people, you know, being the king of the world as far as they know. There's a hole in the ground where marigolds used to grow, things like that. You know, it sounds like there's been a bit of a Holocaust that's happened there. You know, kind of eerie, but, you know, there's that kind of cynical removal from reality that you often get from Steely Dan on that song. And, you know, it's just one of my favorites on this album. My overall impression of this is that, as with their first album, you know, Steely Dan are at this point still really in search of what they're going to be. They're getting close, but the transition is not complete. You know, this is not Asia or Gaucho or even the Royal Scam. I was telling my friend Noah the other day, his favorite Steely Dan album being Pretzel Logic, which came after this in 1974, that I felt that especially with the first 4 Steely Dan albums from 1972, 1975, each album was basically part of a continuing concept that they, you know, illustrated from album to album. You know, they were basically a rock group with jazz references. They weren't an all-the-way jazz funk fusion group as you would get on Asia. And despite Walter Becker's insistence, they definitely were that by that time, if you understand how music works, of course. And this album finds a more unified Steely Dan sound. They don't have David Palmer there. Honestly, his presence on the first album, I felt kind of weak in Steely Dan. Donald Fagen's vocals are so distinctive and idiosyncratic in the way it's phrased that it just is the Steely Dan sound. I can't imagine anybody singing lead vocals other than Donald Fagen. It just is so much his domain, and it certainly isn't David Palmer. And so the fact he isn't on this album, apparently the label encouraged Fagen and them not to keep him. They let him go at this point. So that makes a difference. As far as the background vocalist, Michael McDonald was the man for Donald Fagen. Both complemented each other really well on Katie Lied and Asia years later, of course. But with this album, there's a little interesting tidbit about the cover. Only the first 3 figures were supposed to be present on it, but these figures were added because this band was a quintet at the time. And, you know, looking at these figures now, I know it's an abstract painting, but they look somewhat malformed, you know, like they were mutated. And you know, I wonder if this is a visual interpretation of the lyric of King of the World. You know, you gotta wonder sometimes if Steely Dan isn't really dark and creepy underneath it all. The world may never know. Some hear sweetness, some hear, you know, sadness, I don't know. Some hear different things. But in any case, this is the point where Steely Dan's sound started to really coalesce. You know, to be honest, if you are a lover of Pretzel Logic or Katie Lied, you will feel much more at home with this album than you probably will with Can't Buy a Thrill. Donald Fagen sings the lead vocals on all of this. His piano and his keyboards are felt in some way on every song. And, you know, Walter Becker and his writing are really coming together. This is where the Steely Dan sound, at the end of the day, really all happened. And that's how I feel about Countdown to Ecstasy. Enjoy your music. Enjoy your Steely Dan if you're an admirer. Peace, everybody.